For decades, Charles Bronson was the face Hollywood reached for whenever a story needed a man who didn't flinch. Granite jaw, flat stare, a voice that sounded like it had been sanded down by 30 years of hard living. That was the image. But images are built, not born, and the man underneath that image spent his whole life quietly at odds with it. Now, 2 decades after his death, the people closest to him, his own children among them, have started talking more openly about who Charles Bronson actually was behind the screen persona that made him famous, and what they describe as a far more complicated, far more human figure than the toughest man in movies the posters promised. Stick with us, because the real story of Charles Bronson is stranger, sadder, and in some ways more admirable than the legend. To understand any of it, you have to start in Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, a company-owned coal town tucked into the Allegheny Mountains, the kind of place where the whole community existed to feed one mine. Charles Dennis Uchinsky was born there on November 3rd, 1921, one of 15 children squeezed into a Lithuanian immigrant household that never had enough of anything, not space, not money, not food some weeks. His father worked the mine and rarely spoke. His mother held the household together through sheer will. English wasn't spoken at home. The family communicated in Lithuanian, and young Charles didn't pick up much English until he was already in school, which left with an accent that followed him for years and made grown men in the army assume he'd been born somewhere in Eastern Europe rather than in the United States. Poverty like that leaves marks, and Bronson carried his for the rest of his life. When his father died of illness in the early 1930s, 10-year-old Charles lost the one figure who might have shielded him from what came next. Within a few years, he was following his older brothers into the mine itself, hauling coal for roughly $1 a ton, working shift that left grown men exhausted, let alone a teenager. He would later describe the tunnels as suffocating in a way that never fully left him, a claustrophobia that showed up decades later on movie sets, and a memory of the smell of coal dust that he said clung to him long after he'd become one of the best-paid actors in the world. It's worth sitting with that detail for a second. The man Hollywood would sell as indestructible spent his adolescence terrified of being trapped underground and never entirely stopped being that person. The mines let go of him in 1943 when he was drafted into the Army Air Forces during the Second World War. For a kid who'd known nothing but a company town and a coal seam, the military was, strangely, an opening rather than a cage. He trained at Kiman Army Airfield in Arizona and eventually served in the Pacific Theater as a gunner aboard AB-29 bomber, flying combat missions in the final push against Japan. He didn't talk about the war much in later life. That reticence would become a signature trait, but those who knew him said he carried a real pride in having served, even if he preferred silence to storytelling when the subject came up. Discharged in 1946, he came home with no clear plan and drifted to the kind of odd jobs that fill in the gap between a wartime life and whatever comes next. Working in a bakery, calling bingo numbers on the Atlantic City boardwalk, picking up whatever paid. It was almost by accident that acting entered the picture. Using the GI Bill, he enrolled in art classes in Philadelphia, chasing an old interest in painting and drawing rather than performing. A local theater company needed someone to help paint sets, and the job put him in daily contact with actors for the first time in his life. Something about watching them work appealed to him, and before long he wasn't just painting the backdrops. He was auditioning for small parts in front of them. By 1949, he decided to gamble on it fully, moving to California to study at the Pasadena Playhouse. That same year, he married Harriet Tendler, a fellow aspiring actress he'd met back east. He was 27, she was 18, and neither of them had any money or any guarantee that the gamble would pay off. His first film credit came in 1951, in a forgettable service comedy called You're in the Navy Now, in a role so small it barely registered. A far cry from the star he'd eventually become, and a reminder just how long the road to recognition actually was for him. That road included a name change that has become one of the more famous footnotes in Hollywood history. Born Buchinsky, he worked under his birth name through the early 1950s, right into the era of the McCarthy hearings, when anything that sounded Eastern European or vaguely foreign could draw the wrong kind of attention in an industry gripped by paranoia about communism. Advisors and colleagues pushed him to Americanize it. The story that's followed him ever since is that the new name came from Bronson Avenue in Hollywood, near the gate of Paramount Studios, A practical, almost accidental choice for a man who needed something that wouldn't raise eyebrows on a marquee. There's a certain irony buried in that decision. His own father, decades earlier, had gone by Walter instead of his birth name for the same reason, trying to sound a little more American in a country that wasn't always kind to immigrants. Father and son, a generation apart, both quietly editing themselves to survive. Fame, when it eventually came, didn't come easily or quickly. Bronson spent most of the 1950s in small supporting roles, a lab assistant in a horror picture, minor parts in westerns and war films, guest spots on television anthology series. He was, by his own account and by the account of people who worked with him, exactly what he looked like, rough-edged, unpolished, more comfortable saying nothing than performing charm. That worked against him in an industry still obsessed with matinal good looks, but it also became, eventually, his entire appeal. Directors slowly figured out that Bronson didn't need dialogue to hold a scene. His stillness did the work. Machine Gun Kelly in 1958 gave him his first real lead role, and it opened a door, but the door that mattered most turned out to be in Europe rather than America. French actor Alain Delon had seen Bronson's work and was drawn to exactly the qualities Hollywood had been unsure what to do with: the silence, the weathered face, the sense that this was a man who had actually lived hard rather than one playing at it. Delon brought him to France for Rue El Ami in 1968, and the film turned Bronson into a genuine star across Europe almost overnight, years before mainstream America caught up. Italian and French audiences gave him nicknames that translated roughly to the Ugly One and the Sacred Monster, terms of deep affection dressed up as insult, the kind of nickname you only earn once a country has fully adopted you. For a while, Bronson was arguably more famous in Rome and Paris than he was in his own country, a strange position for an American actor to occupy, and one that stung a little, according to people who knew him. The sense at home had taken so long to notice what Europe saw immediately. Back in the United States, roles like Danny Valinsky in The Great Escape and Bernardo O'Reilly in The Magnificent Seven had already put him in front of American audiences, even if he was often overshadowed by flashier co-stars like Steve McQueen. Interestingly, his tunnel-digging character in The Great Escape brushed up directly against his own history. The character's fear of enclosed spaces wasn't a stretch of imagination for Bronson at all. It was lived experience from a mind resurfacing on a soundstage. He mentioned in interviews decades later that the sensation of being boxed in, even something as small as riding the backseat of a car, could still trigger the same old unease. The tough guy image and the private reality were, in that one specific way, exactly the same thing, which is rarer than it sounds for actors who build careers out of playing characters unlike themselves. By the time the 1970s arrived, Bronson was moving into the role that would define him for the rest of his career and, in many ways, for the rest of his life in the public imagination: the vigilante. Death Wish, released in 1974, cast him as Paul Kersey, a mild-mannered New York architect who turns to armed retaliation after his family is brutally attacked. The film became a massive, controversial hit, tapping directly into a very real anxiety running through American cities at the time about crime and a justice system many people felt had failed them. Critics were split. Some saw it as reckless glorification of vigilante violence, others as a grim, cautionary portrait of what happens when a person's faith in the system collapses entirely. Bronson himself leaned toward the second reading, arguing that the film's violence was meant to horrify rather than celebrate, even as audiences cheered in theaters every time Kersey pulled the trigger. For sequels followed over the next 2 decades, cementing an image of Bronson as an untouchable, unkillable avenger that the actual man found increasingly hard to live up to or escape from. Away from the cameras, the private Bronson bore almost no resemblance to that image, and this is where the more recent conversations from people in his own family become genuinely revealing. He was, by multiple accounts, including those closest to him, a man who struggled with anxiety in specific, sometimes surprising ways, an intense discomfort around germs that made him avoid ordinary physical contact like handshakes, and a real fear of fire that reportedly kept him from booking hotel rooms above the 2nd or 3rd floor, in case he ever needed to escape quickly. He also carried a lifelong wariness of crowds and small talk, preferring long stretches of solitude to socializing, a preference that got misread constantly as arrogance or hostility. Journalists who tried to draw him out often came away frustrated. He had little patience for questions about the meaning of his films, and even less patience for critics he felt were attacking him personally rather than reviewing his work honestly. Some of that reputation for prickliness was earned. There are well-documented accounts of tense, occasionally physical clashes with directors who he felt didn't understand what he was trying to do with a character. But people who actually spent time with him off-set also described moments of real warmth that rarely made it into print, because warmth doesn't sell magazines the way toughness does. Before any of that stardom arrived, though, there was a much leaner chapter worth lingering on: the New York years, when Bronson was sharing a cramped apartment with fellow struggling actor Jack Klugman, long before either of them had a name audiences recognized. The two hustled together, took whatever theater work they could find, and formed a friendship that outlasted both of their eventual fame. Klugman used to tell a story that always got a laugh precisely because it clashed so completely with the persona Bronson would later build. That his roommate, the future king of screen violence, was in fact an unusually skilled ironer of shirts, a small domestic talent picked up somewhere in that enormous family back in Pennsylvania. It's a small detail, almost trivial, but it says something real about how thoroughly the public Bronson and the private Bronson diverged. A man who could press a collar with total precision by day and, decades later, convince an entire industry he'd walk through fire without blinking. Painting was another part of him that rarely made it into the magazine profiles, even though it had been his original reason for enrolling in art school on the GI Bill in the first place. He kept at it quietly throughout his acting career, working under his birth name rather than Bronson specifically so that anyone who bought or reviewed his art would judge it on its own merits rather than as a celebrity curiosity. It sold reasonably well in its own right, which mattered to him more than people realized. Proof, in his own mind, that there was a version of himself capable of making something outside the tough guy machine Hollywood had built around him. Friends who saw him at the easel described a patience and gentleness that almost never showed up in interviews, where he was famously short with journalists who pushed him to explain himself or his craft. "I don't talk about the philosophy of a picture," he once told a reporter flatly, and that unwillingness to perform introspection for the press became, over time, its own kind of performance. The strong, silent act extending off the screen and into every hotel room interview he grudgingly agreed to sit for. That friction with the press occasionally tipped into open hostility. When a biography published in the mid-1970s dug into details of his private life, including his marriage, Bronson was reportedly furious enough to try to slow its release, uncomfortable with the idea of his family being picked apart for a public that, in his view, had no right to any of it beyond what appeared on screen. Critics fared no better when their reviews felt personal rather than professional. More than one writer who panned his films described receiving a pointed, almost theatrically ominous response from Bronson directly, less a genuine threat than a blunt reminder that he read what was written about him and remembered who wrote it. None of this made him an easy man to cover as a journalist, but it does help explain why so little authentic detail about his inner life made it into print while he was alive. He simply refused to hand it over, protecting a private self that the public wouldn't get real access to until decades after his death, through the people who actually lived alongside him rather than the reporters who only ever got an afternoon. That same protectiveness extended into his professional relationships in stranger ways, too. He had a well-known aversion to seeing his own on-screen characters die, treating it almost as a matter of personal principle rather than plot mechanics, a reluctance rooted less in vanity than in the sense that the invincible hero image had become part of what audiences, particularly overseas, expected and needed from him. Directors who wrote his characters into a death scene often found themselves negotiating, sometimes unsuccessfully, to keep the ending the way the script demanded. It's a